remain backstage. She is an academic, educator, and freelance workshop leader. She has been a research assistant to some of the top art historians in the field. Without her, these online lectures would have been impossible. The situation around us, at least in India, is getting from bad to worse, with news about the strike of the virus all around, the suffering of the people, the paucity of oxygen cylinders and hospital beds, and depleting stocks of required medical aid during this emergency. Yet, to maintain our sanity and detract our minds from the mayhem all around us, we decided to continue our programs. As I said the other day, more dangerous than the ongoing viral pandemic is the growing communal trend and the attempts to see our past through the tainted and false glasses of religion. On Friday, we had a lecture through which we discussed the loss of Hindustan and the turning of an inclusive civilization into an exclusive India based on caste and religion. Sometimes back, we held talks on topics like the nature of the Ghaznawide invasions, the actual information contained in the primary sources for that period, the interactions between the Mughals with Vedanta, as well as the intertwined relationships between communities in Gujarat. Today, to carry forward our endeavors of understanding the past, we have a very well-known scholar with us. She is the president of the American Council for South Asian Art. I mean Dr. Alka Patel, who has extensively worked on the early medieval period in India and its built heritage, especially the various monuments in Gujarat. Dr. Alka Patel teaches at the Department of Art History and is involved with the PhD program for visual studies at the University of California, Irvine. She received her BA from Mount Holyoke College and her PhD from Harvard University. Patel's research has focused on South Asia and its connections with Iran and Central Asia, including overland and Indian Ocean maritime networks. Her works include building communities in Gujarat, architecture and society during the 12th-14th centuries, published in 2004 by Brill, and the communities and commodities, Western India and the Indian Ocean, for which she was guest editor of a special issue of Ars Orientalis in 2004. Patel also guest edited Archives of Asian Art number 59 in 2007, a special issue on reuse in South Asian visual culture. I especially remember one of her various papers, which was on this very theme and which she had published in Sacred Landscapes in Asia, Shared Traditions, Multiple Histories, edited by Himanshu Prabhare in 2007. Incidentally, one of my own papers also happened to have been published in the same volume. Dr. Alka Patel's interests ultimately further expanded to include mercantile networks and architectural patronage in the 18th and 19th century South Asia, as evidenced in her work Indo-Muslim Cultures in Transition, which she co-edited with Karen Leonard, published by Brill in 2012. Her recent volume, India and Iran in the Longue Durée, was published in 2017, which was co-edited with ancient Iranist Toraj Daryai, resulted from an international conference convening a wide array of specialists analyzing Indo-Iranian connections over 2 millennia. Her current monographic project is on the Ghorids of Afghanistan and northern India. It is titled India, Iran and Empire, the Shansabānīs of Ghor, circa 1150 to 1250. Today, she will speak to us on the topic Nomads, Islam and Empire, the Shansabānīs of Afghanistan, circa 1150 to 1250. Over to you, Dr. Patel. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for the very generous introduction. I hope that I'm audible and visible. And I must say that I've been following the situation in India with a heavy heart. My parents are in Gujarat, and so I worry about them every day. They claim that they are doing well, and really I feel very connected, even though I'm so far away with all that is going on. I also want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I haven't been able to visit India, including my parents, in the last, more than a year. So I am grateful to feel connected, at least virtually, with people whom I respect, admire there. Shall I begin the PowerPoint? Is that okay? All right. So, ever since childhood, buildings, especially old ones, were fascinating to me as organisms waiting to be known and befriended. My grandparents' apartment in my birthplace of Baroda, in the Salatwada neighborhood, for those of you who know the city, intrigued me with its sleek balconies curved like a ship's prow, where I played, listening to the sound of traffic below. Growing up, I often got the chance to walk down the narrow lanes, both in the old city of Vadodara and in my family's ancestral village, with plenty of intricate wood facades where I could find fantastic creatures and fancy dressed women and men if I looked carefully. By the way, these are images from, of course, Vaso, although my paternal ancestral village is Sojitra, but they're all a part of this Charotar Gujarati world, if you will. Only in graduate school was I able to identify the first as probably a trace of the arts décoratif aesthetic that had come to pervade many colonial sites. And here you see a view of a building very much like my grandparents' apartment, but in downtown Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And of course, the second set of images that I showed dated to the 18th century. All of these structures evoked wonder, the smells of life, inspiring nebulous queries of how the people inside made these gigantic things feel like safe places, some even called home. The ongoing mystery eventually, became more urgent when we moved to the outskirts of Baroda into a white, angular, multi-storied and terraced house with steel Gujarati letters on the front, spelling Alka. Yes, named after me. It was a house everybody called modern, where there was more room than I could ever fully command, and where extended family and old friends visited less frequently, not knowing where to sit or how long to stay when they did. As I grew up, all these edifices and the sensations they awakened morphed into more pointed questions, such as, how can houses where people just live look so different? What makes people choose one kind of space over another? Is one better than another? And why do people act differently in different spaces? Well, the small girl's curious or even rebellious streak began to surface as she attempted to reconcile what she saw with what she was told. Growing up in Gujarat, the girl had often heard things like Muslims have different habits, they eat meat, and they aren't our kind of people. But this was jarring, since the many temples the girl had been dragged to throughout her childhood looked and felt so different, like felt so much like the mosques she dared to enter on her own a little later. It was in things then, and perhaps especially in buildings, where the space between seeming and being was palpable and could be tangibly explored. Coming to the US as a pre-adolescent added a new and much larger cultural dimension to these ruminations. Talk about different buildings and spaces and the way people act. Throughout high school and college, I felt at times uncomfortably different from the people who already lived here, not unlike those friends and relatives visiting our modern house in the Baroda suburbs. I felt I had no choice but to try to make sense of these sensations. Ironically, as is the case with many immigrants, I learned more about the cultural, religious, linguistic, and political history of South Asia as a young adult in the US than during my early years in India. It dawned on me that I was not any single thing, that being Indian, in reality, encompassed a multitude of apparently contradictory meanings. My maternal language of Gujarati, the Indian textiles I loved, or my most comforting foods were all the products of an intimate intertwining of indigenous and imported elements, many of the latter coming from the Islamic world. By now, you may be asking whether this autobiographical indulgence is gratuitous or actually bears some intellectual relevance. Suffice it to say that my intellectual life, like that of so many others, is not strictly separable from the personal. The indelible sensory stimuli of a childhood in India and the family history of transition from agrarian to urban surroundings and participation in the unique modernity of post-independence and post-partition India, which so many were also shaping throughout the last quarter of the 20th century. As such, this slight digression also underscores what is really at stake in my intellectual labor, a raw reality that does not effectively come through in a purely scholarly excursus. Thus, the unabashedly intellectual and personal questions that have persisted in my mind. What makes a building Islamic? What makes it Indian? Even though political movements have risen and fallen and geopolitical conflagrations, arguably partition itself, have broken out precisely around this question, I have always had the sneaking feeling that the two labels are inadequate to the task of containing the buildings, just as they are inadequate for people. Until this inadequacy is acknowledged and alternatives earnestly attempted, South Asia's intra-regional confrontations would only continue to be writ small in the uncomfortable self-interrogation of its politically divided, though culturally connected inhabitants and diaspora. My scholarly experience has led me to be fascinated by the ways in which the built environment embodies and reconciles seeming contradictions in physical form. For instance, buildings are at once spatially and temporally rooted and quasi-mobile, requiring local and at times extra-local resources, depending on available skills and materials. From their rootedness, they can nonetheless alter landscapes all around. And as historical buildings traverse time, they accrue new functions and meanings according to the communities who use them. In the face of all the curiosity a historical structure inspires, one thing is abundantly clear to me, namely that I cannot imagine knowing it without seeing it and experiencing it for myself, visually, verbally, and haptically recording its details, its scale, and its construction materials, all contributing to reawakening those smells of life that emanated at various moments throughout its existence. It follows that documenting a historical building has at times called for risking comfort and safety, not to mention protestations from many quarters. Undertaking fieldwork for my doctoral dissertation in Pakistan presented just such risks and opportunities. Despite the worry of my parents and even my PhD advisor, who was the late Dr. Pramod Chandra, all of whom had lived the majority of their lives in a post-partition India, the opportunity to look the constructed other in the face and see if we really were different was one I could not turn away. In Pakistan, documenting the surviving Salt Range temples and Ghaznavid remains in West Punjab, Swat, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, previously Northwest Frontier Province, Multan as a city of tombs, containing some of the most charismatic Sufi personalities of the medieval early modern world, and the 8th through 18th century Islamic remains of Sindh, so evocative of my natal Gujarat, all forcibly created a bridge between my younger impressions and adult intellectualism. It was at this time that my attention was called by the Shansabānīs, more popularly known as the Ghurids, though this is a term I avoid for reasons I shall offer below. It is the Shansabānīs who are, I believe, pivotal in the subcontinent's historically specific Islamization. Although my first book elucidated the architectural innovations resulting from the sustained commercial and cultural connectivity between coastal Western India and maritime Islam during the 12th through 14th centuries, I continued to plan a project offering me a more complete understanding of the historical moment when a politically and culturally ascendant Islam took root in the Indo-Gangetic plains. This significant historical process, in which the Shansabānīs played an integral role, came to have indelible and enduring linguistic, religious, political, and cultural ramifications for all of South Asia well into the present day. Hence, the two-book project on the Shansabānīs took shape, the first of which will be published later this year by Edinburgh University Press. Admittedly, when we think of the Shansabānīs or Ghurids, their architectural traces in the North Indian plains come to mind, specifically a corpus of 5 mosque complexes, which I propose expanding to 7 with 2 works I published almost 10 years ago. Among the works dating to the Shansabānī expansion into the Doab, the better-known examples are the Congregational Mosque of Ajmer and, of course, the Qutb Mosque and its attendant Qutb Minar. In all of these constructions, the perimeter aisles and Qibla areas are replete with reused structural components, such as columns stacked in 2s and 3s to create height, and entire ceilings extracted from their previous fabrics and reinstalled in new contexts. The Shansabānī structure's significance resides not only in their reuse of older building materials, but also simultaneously in their being the very first mosque complexes on a monumental scale in northern India. I have set forth in my previous work, and others have also studied, the Muslim mercantile communities settled at Emporia and along the Indian coast, probably since the 8th century and likely earlier, commissioning mosques and other Islamic ritual structures in these settlements. However, it was not until the 1190s, with the Shansabānīs' successful forays eastward, that Islamic buildings were constructed by Muslim political military elites on a truly grand scale. In 2000, Richard Eaton made important strides in historicizing acts of reuse, collating the textual sources mentioning them and mapping them along moving geopolitical frontiers. He proposed that collectively, temple desecrations, and that is Eaton's term, constituted one of two stratagems simultaneously utilized by new Muslim power seekers entering the subcontinent from Central Asia. The other stratagem being deployment of Sufi sheikhs to, quote, win the hearts and minds of local populations, end quote, as Indo-Muslim imperial formations coalesced. Elsewhere, I have already argued that when scrutinized individually, Eaton's overarching hypothesis that temple desecration constituted the eradication of past political powers and thus was a fundamental act of state building does not hold true in every instance. Nevertheless, his work has reopened possibilities for understanding historical processes rather than foreclosing them. Indeed, an important contribution. Following my own critique of Eaton, then, my current work disaggregates the collective idea of desecrations and further neutralizes them as acts of reuse. But first, we must ask an even more foundational question, namely, where it all began. While the truly fascinating structures attributed to the Shansabānīs in the North Indian regions are arresting in multifarious aspects, they did not appear out of nowhere, just as their patrons had a long and consequential trajectory prior to their entry into the Doab. The story actually began considerably farther west, in historical Khorasan, Eastern Iran through Western Afghanistan in modern terms. But before we gain what available glimpses there are to the origins of the Shansabānīs, I must point out the historiographical fallout of independence and partition in its longue durée reverberations. It would seem that this Janus-natured historical event has erased, or at least occluded, all manner of sins, including historiographical ones. Many of the latter have been unintended, to be sure. It is true that scholars of modern periods in the broadly conceived Indic cultural world, spanning parts of the nation-states of Afghanistan through Bangladesh, continually encounter and also acknowledge the lack of access to important archives. But it is ironic that in the methodological rush to recapture pre-modern pasts, there is relatively little real grappling with partition's interference in the traces of those very pasts and in present apprehensions of them. As Manan Ahmed Asif recently wrote in his book on Chachnama and 13th century Sindh, tellingly subtitled Muslim Origins in South Asia, the simple accident of birthplace has dramatic consequences for archival access, particularly in the case of unmovable historical indices such as buildings and their architectural cultures. It is not, however, only obtaining a visa or other equally insurmountable but ultimately mechanical hurdles to which I refer, rather to the unarticulated presence of partition in the analytical fields of inquiry encompassing pre-modern South Asia. At last, you may say, I come to the two goals I attempt to attain in the remainder of this paper. First, it is imperative to expose the uncanny naturalization of partition in the study of South Asia's pre-modernity, technically quite a lengthy period spanning long before 1947. This naturalization is truly unfortunate, as at times it prevents the examination of indices of historical processes that are, proverbially, staring us in the face. Second, I would like to propose further queries and issues that seem pertinent to me when pre-modern South Asia is the analytical terrain. Vociferous segments of the publics within South Asia's modern nation states hold that partition was actually presaged a millennium earlier. The Afghan Muslim Ghaznavids' idol-breaking raids and the Shansabānī Ghurids' even more momentous architectural spoliations deep within the Indian subcontinent supposedly heralded the fundamental incompatibility of Hindu and Muslim cultures. Certainly, the first Congregational Mosque of Delhi, a foundation dating to 1192-93, and popularly known as Quwwat al-Islam, is seen as the material personification of this civilizational antipathy, the earliest monumental mosque in northern India having been constructed largely with ceilings and columns assumed to come from Hindu temples, with many of the fragments bearing marks of effacement as their figural imagery was removed for use within an Islamic context. It is not only in the public and political spheres that such supposedly monumental representations of Hindu-Muslim antagonism have played a decisive role. Colonial, post-colonial, and contemporary scholarship on South Asia's history and material culture of the so-called medieval period, however that term may also be construed, has also labored against partition's shadow, projected retroactively more than a millennium into the past, treating both corpora, in other words, history and material culture, collectively in the interests of time. One can discern the interpretive pendulum in the early 20th century beginning to swing from Marxism to post-independence nationalism, traversing the 70s and 80s might is right of petroleum Islam, and continuing into the present day, still seeking theoretical nuance in the face of the constructed mutual exclusivity of partition. To the point, scholarship is not free of that construction, even though in historical terms it is blatantly anachronistic. The question remains then of how, to paraphrase Shahid Amin, quote, we essay non-sectarian histories of conquest and conflict, end quote, and train an analytical gaze, which at least attempts equanimity on the crucial and quintessentially historical process of the establishment of a whole new set of protagonists as politically ascendant in the northern Indian subcontinent. My current response to this admittedly daunting question has been two-pronged. First is an analytical gaze trained on the object writ large in terms of medium and permitting focus on architecture. Again, in the interests of time, I must elide, that wonderful word, the process by which I have come to conceptualize a method I term architectural biography. In brief, it capitalizes on the very rootedness of buildings and relies on archaeological and anthropological data related to these monumental objects, their ontology qua object, however, also requiring art historical engagement. Second, I submit that there is something about analyzing the object, the visual that is seen more than the scripted, textual that is read, which allows for the eschewal of religion-based modifiers, despite the historically accidental survival of greater numbers of religious structures than others. It is my hope that this will become apparent in the examples analyzed below. But let me say here that this focus on the object in turn creates a palpable suspension of the phenomenon of partition and its accompanying analytical assumptions, which for the last 70 years have tended to predetermine investigative approaches as well as outcomes. The above-mentioned monumental complexes were the result of a larger historical trend encompassing Central and South Asia, namely the influx of nomadic populations identifying as Muslim, coming from modern Afghanistan and beyond via the northwest mountain passes into the Indus valleys and the Punjab, and ultimately the North Indian plains. According to Marshall Hodgson's reckoning, the long 12th century was a period of the cementing of Persian as a pan-Eurasian language of power. In more recent scholarship, the time frame has further been acknowledged as pivotal, when not only new imperial centers were being established, but indeed the very structures of cultural, political, and economic power had begun shifting and coalescing anew. These processes of change were effected as incoming populations from the Eurasian steppes, most notably the Seljuks, made their way into the Perso-Islamic world. In light of several and continued movements of people, then, I would propose that it is important to recast the Mongols as numbering among successive nomadic confederacies migrating westward, likely due to a series of political, social, and possibly also environmental impetuses. These at times violent waves of migration and eventual settlement effectively connected South and Central Asia for centuries to come, culminating in the 16th century establishment of the Mughal Empire. But the very first such newcomers into northern India interest us here. Just as the patrons of the buildings under discussion. Given the Shansabānīs' decidedly non-elite origins in, moreover, the largely uncharted areas of central Afghanistan, they are commonly labeled the Ghurids in modern scholarship. However, it may be apparent by now that this term is less than adequate, as the particular kinship-based group who enter historical records as the Shansab do in fact distinguish themselves from their fellow Ghuris, and their territorial campaigns had notable consequences far beyond their native Ghur. It was, after all, specifically the Shansabānīs, rather than other Ghuris, who introduced their interpretation of Persianate kingship and cultures of power into northern India, which subsequently dispersed in varying forms throughout the rest of the subcontinent. Thus, the Shansabānīs effectively served as precedents for the next several centuries, as incoming power seekers established a series of smaller polities, some enduring through the 17th century, even as the Mughals laid claim to the north, in what has become the Sultanate period of South Asian history. Without a doubt, there is much to be said, but in the time that remains, I limit myself to two, hopefully provocative ideas. First, in order to understand North India's earliest monumental mosque architecture, India alone is not enough. We must look farther afield at the nomadic origins of the Shansabānīs in Afghanistan to begin identifying the multivalent impetuses, processes, and eventual receptions of their extensive architectural reuse throughout their conquered lands. Second, this long-term project on the Shansabānīs has reiterated for me the virtually infinite value of the object in the largest sense in elucidating historical processes, and perhaps counterintuitively, the potential for architectural analysis in particular to provide rarely available access into nomadic societies of the past. But before embarking in earnest, I must make the presentation equivalent of a footnote. Given the difficulty of fieldwork in large swaths of Afghanistan, including the central region of Ghur itself, projects such as mine rely on historical photographs of areas where direct access is not possible. Being a photogenic land of truly magnificent landscapes and architecture and colorful people, it has arrested the picturesque imagination at least since the First Anglo-Afghan War, continuing to do so into the age of photography. Its lofty ruins and nomadic populations seem unchanging, aesthetically evocative subjects begging to be orientalized. I myself could not help but capture the wide open plains edged by mountains outside of the western city of Herat, appearing as natural proscenia upon which great histories unfolded. But such modern fetishism actually distracts from the long-standing reality of this easternmost part of the Iranian world. Afghanistan was a busy place, being the strategic point for control of much of Eurasia, as realized by the Sasanians, various Hunnic groups such as the Hephthalites, and the Western Turks, to name only a few who built and consolidated empires starting and sometimes ending here. Moreover, these picturesque but artificially empty vistas occlude the prevailing reality of the vast majority of the Iranian Persianate cultural sphere well into the 19th century, what has best been described as the nomad-urban continuum. This concept not only frames the cultural, political, and economic symbiosis between sedentists and nomads, it also emphasizes the flexibility in lifestyles as individuals and groups respond to changing circumstances over time. Indeed, the nomad-urban continuum's encapsulation of flexibility and life economy symbioses is essential to understanding the emergence of far-reaching nomadic empires in the medieval Islamic world, most notably the Seljuks, the Shansabānīs, and eventually the Mongols. The physical inaccessibility of Afghanistan, however, has been somewhat ameliorated by technology and has sparked community archaeology perhaps like never before. In the village of Daqadi, which is located in the very center of Afghanistan, just south of the Harirud, the country's major west-flowing riverine artery, the inhabitants had lived with the remains of an apparently historical mud brick structure in their midst for as long as they could remember. A knowledgeable local elder finally brought it to the attention of a touring American military officer in 2013, who in turn contacted Dr. David Thomas, an archaeologist who had conducted surface surveys and excavations in Ghur in the early 2000s. Relying on historical mentions of a minar and its approximate location, triangulating with available satellite imagery and coordinates, and comparing the rediscovered tower with more firmly dated examples from Seljuk Iran, the Daqadi Minar was convincingly identified as an early Shansabānī commission, I would say even the first, to be discussed further momentarily. It is already known that, like other nomadic empires, the Shansabānīs also maintained a degree of nomadism, even after attaining far-reaching territorial conquests by the mid-12th century. They were seasonally transhumant between what was probably their summer capital of Firuzkoh at the mountainous confluence of two rivers and an as yet unidentified winter destination somewhere near historical Zemindavar. In my work, I propose that it is equally important to piece together their pre-imperial history by analyzing all available sources. Admittedly, this is a challenge for which not all disciplines are equipped. Archaeology, for example, has long grappled with recuperating nomadism's traces in the historical landscape. Generally, nomadic economies do not require architecturally skilled labor, given the mobility of people and goods, nor could they hire such labor and commission buildings without surplus production. Indeed, such physical lacunae are only exacerbated by nomads' reputation for violence and other seemingly anti-societal tendencies, like brigandage or simple disregard in court-centered chronicles of both the Persianate and Indic cultural worlds. In fact, the panegyric poetry of the Shansabānīs court littérature and the 13th century chronicle called Tabaqat-e-Nasiri, a rare history detailing the Shansabānīs' rise and fall, though it was composed at Delhi in northern India for reasons that will become clear, altogether erase the clan's localized and nomadic beginnings, substituting these with mythical origins among the pre-Islamic kings of Iran. How then to explain the literal littering of southern Ghur with remains of individual towers and even entire fortified complexes? Despite acknowledging the early Shansabānīs' nomadic lifestyles and economies, historians and archaeologists have attributed the construction of these remains to them. In my book, I argue the following points in greater detail and marshaling extensive evidence, but let me condense some of the argumentation here. The building methods and decorative iconography of many of southern Ghur's architectural remains date them in all likelihood to Sasanian Hephthalite or Western Turkic presence in the region, or the early 7th through 9th centuries. Particularly due to subsistence nomadism throughout the Shansabānīs' pre-imperial phase, they and other Ghuris, rather than commissioning new buildings, probably reuse these architectural remains as places of shelter or storage during seasonal transhumance. Furthermore, the Shansabānīs' patronage of the Dāqa-di Minar at the beginning of the 12th century in northern Ghur, more than 200 kilometers away, was a definitive indication of their economic and socio-religious metamorphosis into a regional and eventually trans-regional political power. Pinpointing the factors in this transformation, such as how precisely they shifted to an economy of surplus production that allowed for the patronage of skilled architectural laborers, may never come to light. But what the Dāqa-di Minar does signal is this nomadic group's more declarative identification with Islam and Perso-Islamicate culture. In the absence of more historical data, I have utilized modern anthropological research on nomadic groups as a possible parallel to the Shansabānīs' historical shifts. Again, due to time limitations, I summarize here that akin to nomadic cultures in the present day, the Shansabānīs were also probably long exposed to varieties of Islam in central Afghanistan, but unable or uninterested in reconciling daily and annual life cycles of nomadism with an essentially unrelated great tradition. Only when their politico-economic fortunes catapulted them onto a larger stage did they don an identifiably Perso-Islamic identity, transitioning from an unknown nomadic clan to legitimate imperial contenders against the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks. By about 1150, a senior Shansabānī lineage was installed at Bamiyan, a much more researched and studied part of Afghanistan than Ghur, and whose pre-Islamic past is more thoroughly known thanks to its status as a major commercial center and preeminent pilgrimage site in the Buddhist world. The Bamiyan Valley's religious patronage and general notoriety was a direct result of its location on major east-west and north-south routes of travel, which connected Central Asia and India. Indeed, Bamiyan had been a pivotal location as alliances were forged, broken, and reforged between the Sasanians' eastern representatives and clients and new nomadic groups, such as the Western Turks, making inroads in the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era. Given Bamiyan's linchpin location, it is little surprise that the entire region was dotted with extensive remains of past occupation. According to the archaeological evidence thus far, with the exception of only one newly constructed royal fortification, the Shansabānīs again reused several of the older hilltop complexes. For example, Shah-e-Golgole, which we encountered previously due to its dramatic visual appeal. Evidently, there was very little 12th century intervention in the actual fabric of the complex. Shansabānī occupation revealed principally through the rediscovery of architectural fittings and assemblages of luxury ceramics. While the latter were apparently locally produced, they were very much inflected with the modes of ceramic manufacture in the Eastern Persianate regions of the pre-Mongol centuries. Arguably, the most intriguing mark of Shansabānī presence in the entire Bamiyan region was at Dynastic, about 50 kilometers northeast of the Bamiyan Valley. The quadrangular structure with corner towers appears to have been the typical mid-1st millennium CE fortified Buddhist monastery, not unlike the famous Mes Aynek complex just south of Kabul, where excavations are ongoing. But at Dynastic, a chamber to the east of the main entrance received a later mihrab with geometrical stucco revetment. Although this element did not seem to have an extant inscription, on comparative stylistic grounds, it is datable to the latter half of the 12th century. By contrast, there is no discernible sign of Shansabānī intervention in the main valley of Bamiyan and its towering Buddha niches, the sculptures being only one aspect of the overall site, which also boasted truly lavish painted programs throughout. The surrounding valleys in the Bamiyan Basin were also home to more Buddhist monastic institutions, large and small, with the area being extremely well patronized thanks to the convergence there of commerce, pilgrimage, and Western Turkic or Hephthalite royal presence. The Shansabānīs did little, if anything, to interfere in the well-oiled economic machinery of the Bamiyan region, much less disturb or destroy the artistic production that only testified to the area's trans-Eurasian importance and doubtless also helped attract pilgrims and others from afar. As we know, it was not until more than 8 centuries later that the Taliban appropriated the dubious distinction of destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas. By the late 1180s, the Shansabānīs pushed farther east in their imperial expansion, successfully using locales along the Indus and the city of Lahore in the Punjab as springboards for campaigns into northern India. While it may never be clear what precisely prompted them to push farther and farther east, 2 factors should be considered. One is that, like the nomadic Seljuks, the Shansabānī elites also continued to fulfill the roles of nomadic tribal chiefs and had increasing demands of pasturage, small-scale agriculture, and the other necessities of pastoral nomadism to accommodate that were thrust upon them as their numbers of affiliates and military recruits swelled exponentially. Second, as was the case for many emerging imperial formations in the past, the Shansabānīs could have also been following the directions of momentum of their predecessors, In this case, the infamous Ghaznavids had already made plundering inroads into northern India, which the Shansabānīs were compelled to follow as they filled the political and economic vacuum left by the Ghaznavids' disintegration. The foregoing circuitous loop brings us back to northern India, where we began. I spend less time on the Shansabānīs' Indian buildings, as I have extensively argued elsewhere that they were not random acts of pillage, but rather, conceivably, of salvage. It is consistently the case, for example, that large structural components were carefully extracted in toto from previous contexts and just as carefully reinstalled in new ones. Furthermore, the most ornate, older fragments appear at architectural and ritual focal points within mosques. Intriguingly, this trend also maps onto the internal development of temple architecture in northern India, where earlier, more sculptural approaches gradually took on punctual applications of carved decoration. All of these observations indicate that the Shansabānīs patronized the local makers of buildings, whose expertise was required for the extraction of usable structural components and their replacement in new architectural fabrics. Most notably, these newly introduced building methods, for example, stacking columns atop each other, was not lost upon the local workers, who in turn extended the traditional proportions of column orders to heighten the interiors of subsequent temples. What we have seen until now surely complicates the reception of the Shansabānī presence in northern India. In the book, I propose that their early nomadic beginnings predisposed them to refashioning inherited landscapes according to their needs, an expediency that they implemented also in their wider conquests such as Bamiyan. The fact that this area's blatantly iconic major Buddhist institutions were left largely unaltered further intimates a region-specific mode of empire building, which gives pause to any reflexive interpretation of the Indian buildings solely as acts of iconoclasm. Nevertheless, the larger notion of Islamic iconoclasm has a powerful hold on the contemporary public imagination, certainly in India and elsewhere, which in turn creates new political realities with global consequences. While the response to the truly abhorrent idea of fake news has been facts matter, I wonder if we are not missing the point, which is whether facts can make a difference, particularly in creating a new present. Thank you. I think I've gone on long enough. Let me stop sharing the screen. Is that possible? Somehow? Stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Alka Patel.
Of course.
Really fascinating lecture with many, many new insights. And thank you for a sneak peek into the book, which would, I hope, be out soon, say by the end of the year or by next year. So I think we did have a good sneak peek of the type of work which you are doing.
I hope I didn't give it all away. There is actual more evidence in the book.
What I found remarkable, however, was how you shifted from the past to the present and then back. That was, I mean, remarkable because you gave us a feeling of the region, how it is today and how it was, and what actually were, who actually were the Shansabānīs and what was their contribution, without having any biases. Let us have a few questions which have been asked to you. Can I? Uh, uh,
Ah,
how Shansabānī dynasty converted to Islam from Buddhism, and did Minaret of Jam, which is in Afghanistan, had any influence on the making of Qutub Minar?
of course, an excellent question. So, actually, the really early periods of Shansabānī, or indeed Hori history, are very much unknown due to the reasons that I referred to throughout the talk. And we know that really historical records emerge only when there are scribes and writers who are hired to narrativize these histories. Now, prior to their emergence as political and economic uh, uh, bases of power, many of these regions simply went largely unrecorded, except, of course, in the very localized histories, and many of those were transmitted or circulated in forms that were ephemeral. So I preface the answer to the question with all of that because it's actually unclear whether what their kind of religious life was, especially in this naturally kind of insulated region of Hur, what the kind of religious culture of this region had been. Certainly, there is an insulation, if not an isolation, geographically and otherwise, that the region was characterized by, but it was not completely impregnable, so to speak. And indeed, there were people who had contact with the inhabitants of the areas comprised within it. So I would suspect that indeed, if we look on a map at where the historical region of Hur is located, it in fact is contiguous with areas that for a very long time, ever since the very first inroads under Umayyad and then Abbasid um, uh, deputation, there had been expansionist forays from Western Asia into Central Asia, including modern Afghanistan. So some of the more so-called heterodox movements, such as the Kharijites, had established themselves and really operated from bases within Sistan, which was on the southern contiguous border with historical Hur. So perhaps a good map might be the one that was of the more focused view on Hur itself. You can see Zamin Davar to the south, and then Sistan to the southwest. I would say it is slide number 40. So, yes, perhaps an even better, forgive me, slide number 30 would help the audience see the overall map without the photographic superimpositions. So, most likely, I think there was a contact with multifarious types of Islam in the region, both due to the location of historical Hur, but also due to the regular transhumance of these populations from the northern part, which then would abut the routes of communication radiating eastward from major emporia such as Herat. And in the south, of course, with the aforementioned Sistan, as well as the really pivotal city of Kandahar. I think it was most likely sort of, for lack of a better term, a kind of dialogical relationship with various types of Islam that were assimilated by these nomadic pastoralists who were the principal inhabitants of these regions. And it was really only slightly later, as their fortunes began to rise dramatically, that there was kind of a shift towards a greater orthodoxy, the so-called great tradition that anthropologists and others, Ernst Gellner, sort of coined this phrase several decades ago. So it was really a matter of kind of negotiating these various spheres. Now, as far as the architectural connections and conversations, I would say absolutely. The minar that was constructed in Jam, and it's as my colleagues, all of you might know, it's been redated really to the 1170s rather than the 1190s, and a re-examination of the epigraphic program. So indeed, it is quite almost an immediate precursor or predecessor, architecturally speaking, to the foundation of the minar within the Qutb complex, which, as we know, happened several years, in fact, after the foundation of the actual mosque. So certainly in terms of overall morphology, there was a relationship, I would say, and these towering architectural commissions had really taken on multiple meanings throughout the Persianate world. I showed some examples of the Seljuk towers and the Isfahan oasis. And in fact, one could say that the Seljuks really kind of, re-signified these minars as these extremely communicative architectural foundations that eventually had extremely complex epigraphic programs. So the construction of the minar at Jam has received a lot of attention, and of course the redating that I mentioned before. Therefore, it would absolutely be certainly architecturally speaking and conceptually a precursor to the Qutb Minar.
Right. Can you just once more repeat the chronology so that people may understand it further? In a concise form, you just repeat the chronology once again.
So my overall chronology, I believe, and obviously this is founded on as much historical data as can be gathered, and this would be textual as well as material. But I would say that we are examining really the interstices of the long 12th century. I would say that, of course, regions in central Afghanistan and elsewhere were places where nomadic pastoralists and other types of societies existed. But really, the Shansab, as an eventually more significant part of the Huri context, really come into shall we say, the beginnings of their trajectory to this trans-regional importance, I would say in the early decades of the 12th century. And really, most of their activities were located within what we now think of as modern Afghanistan. And really, it wasn't until the decade of the 1170s, after the definitive conquest of Ghazna, in fact, which then occasioned the first real orientation, if you will, towards the Eastern campaigns. So we see that even in 1178, as you know, there is this extremely revealing and important inscription at the site of Kiradu in Bardmer district, southern Rajasthan, which talks about the destruction that that particular group of structures underwent when are they referred to as Turushkas? I'm not sure, the aggressors, who I forget how they're exactly referred to, but already there was an attempt at making some kind of a foray into northern India, much along the same lines as the Ghaznavid campaign of 1025, which reached all the way into Gujarat, coastal Gujarat, in fact. But it was an unsuccessful campaign. And then later on, there was, and this is written about by Juzjani, that there was the sort of campaign of vindication by Ibek later to avenge the defeat of the earlier one. And that actually might have been what the Kiradu inscription commemorates, meaning it talks about the destruction that this group of temples had undergone. So then we come to circa 1178, 1180. And then actually there were a couple of further different tacks, different strategies, rather than taking the southern passes into the area of Gujarat and southern Rajasthan. In fact, there was an attempt at bypassing all of that and going straight into the Doab, right, the North Indian plains. And that, as we know, after one failed attempt, there was a successful one in the very early 1190s, about 1192, the second Battle of Tarain.
Right. Thank you for repeating this. Let me have the back question by Mirza Hastan. Shagufta, can we have the question by Mirza Hastan first? What are some of the Ghorid dynasty era heritage buildings that have survived in Pakistan? And this is one of the questions. And the second question by Mirza Hastan is, Madam, is it true that Shansabānī dynasty was the dreaded enemy of Ghaznavid dynasty and eliminated Ghaznavid dynasty altogether? These are the two questions which Mirza Hassan asks.
So these are actually excellent questions, and they really drill down, as they say, to the specific locales where we might find certainly, architectural indices. And you might have glimpsed on one of the maps that I used later, specifically slide number 47. I showed some structures that now fall within the nation-state boundaries of Pakistan. And because of the lack of epigraphy and other kinds of ancillary but extremely useful information, and perhaps dating and also establishing the patronage of these structures, they really are kind of argued and debated as to where they belong. But I believe that there are at least some are better documented than others, but there are at least three groups of structures basically falling along various points of the Indus, in fact, that should be attributed to Shansabānī. It's hard to call it patronage because we are still talking about a coalescing group of people who is sort of doing a trial and error. and all after their conquest of the city of Ghazni. And Ghazni, that conquest was really what allowed for any kind of further eastward forays. And so, yes, I can go into, if we have the time, I can go into a little more detail about the structures in Pakistan, which I would think date to the time of the Shansabānī campaigns. So we're talking about the later 1170s and 1180s. And sadly, though, in the city of Lahore, there is very, very little, if anything, even from the Ghaznavid period. And this is really the trajectory of virtually all major cities, right, that have continual occupation, that previous strata are simply built over. And it is true, though I guess I would put it as really a series of contestations. The Shansab definitely were the ones who dealt, shall we say, the definitive blow to the Ghaznavid dynasty in Afghanistan. But as we know, there was a period of at least a decade when the later Ghaznavid sultans, in essence, took refuge at their establishments in Lahore and in the Punjab region. During that time, this is the decade of the 1150s and 60s, precisely when the Shansabānīs are not only consolidating control, but one thing that we have to remember is that the Shansabānīs themselves are actually split up into at least three separate but affiliated lineages. And many times they are contentious among themselves. So we have the house at Jam, now pretty much accepted to be Firuzkoh. We also have an equally senior household that was established at Bamiyan, as I talked about. And after the conquest of Ghazna, arguably that was a third Shansabānī lineage that emerged based at Ghazna, but not only at Ghazna, also including Lashkargah, Lashkari Bazar, going all the way to Bust, right, bordering on Sistan. So for better or for worse, I think we have to kind of fragment and complicate the very idea of the Shansabānīs, because they were not this kind of phalanx of a united front that were, pushing forward. Indeed, there were a lot of family struggles and some dirty laundry that got hung out. There was a fierce competition between the Ghazna and the Jam Firuzkoh houses, in fact, and they were constantly sort of luring scholars, so that, and indeed, it was a triangle, and Bamiyan was another competitor. So, in fact, Juzdani's father himself, Maulana Sirajuddin, also found himself kind of lured away from Firuzkoh to the court of Bamiyan. And then with the establishment of the Ghazna lineage, there was a third kind of axis, a third pinpoint. And, really the sustainability, if you will, the viability of the Ghazna lineage could only move forward if there were the Eastern campaigns. I mean, I think, in fact, an analysis specifically of the Ghazna lineage would give us a lot more information on the motivations and the modus, the MOs of the Ghaznavids, their predecessors, why it is that there was this particular relationship that the Ghaznavids had with northern India. And indeed, it was a very different relationship from what the Shansabānīs undertook. And in some part, that could be because of this fragmentation of lineages, which one finds sort of conspicuously and repeatedly documented, for instance, in modern nomadic confederacies, and even the more intimate views of nomadic households and families, where there's a constant over-generational fragmentation of patrimony. So it's a much more, I guess, complicated picture, perhaps, than even I am doing justice to at present. So
Right. I mean, thank you for a very detailed answer to the question which was asked. Uh, before we take up L.M. Mahfouz Priye's two questions, there is a question by Nanak Ganguly. In
yeah.
1204, Muhammad Ghori suffered a crushing defeat and the dynasty almost vanished. Did it happen that Shansabānīs depended too much on Mamluks without any blood relation?
Again, a fascinating question. Now, you are referring to, let's to add to the confusion, both of these brothers were actually they were given the name Muhammad. So are you referring to the senior Muhammad who was operating in Khorasan, I guess? I think you're referring to the confrontation with the Kharazm Shah in 1204, I assume. So, and this actually is important because indeed we have to think about that continual and increasing fragmentation of those three lineages that I mentioned before. So, in fact, the junior clansman, the youngest lineage established at Ghazna, was actually enlisted, yes, into that particular campaign where there was a defeat against the Kharazm Shah. But I think it's important to conceive of who participated where really as a series of favors that was exchanged among these clansmen, while they always maintained their own independent bases of operations. Now, the Ghazna lineage, Shihabuddin would have felt beholden, surely, to Shamsuddin because of the seniority and because, in fact, there was a push towards Ghazna and effectively the establishment of a third lineage, sort of with the tacit approval of the other senior clansmen. So I guess I would fragment and disaggregate these lineages and say that, well, I think that the fortunes of Firuz Ko turned dramatically as a consequence to this defeat by the Kharazm Shahs, because ultimately it was they who, in fact, occupied the site of Firuz Ko, presumably at Jam, about a decade later in about 1215. But so I wouldn't say that the entire dynasty was kind of on its last breath. It is important, I believe, to remember that these fragmented lineages, these patrimonies, if we want to expand the meaning of that term, were effectively kind of mini independent operators. They certainly had kinship and affective relationships with each other. And the idea of, well, you did this for me, so I will do this for you, the whole sort of, what keeps these clans operating together. But I would hesitate really to think of them as a unified dynasty in the end.
Thank you. There are two questions by L.M. Mahfouz Priye. So we'll have the first question by L.A. Mahfouz Priye. Were the Sultanate monuments reusing temples? Temple fragment reflects their secularity towards their architectural policies or as part of their religious philosophy?
If I could ask for perhaps just a little bit of a clarification, are you referring specifically to the Shansabānī structures or all of the Sultanate period structure?
The way the question has been framed, possibly Mahfouz is taking all the Sultanate monuments, not necessarily, because that is how the question has been framed, if I understand his question correctly.
So again, and I don't mean this as simply, kind of shielding myself from unanswerable questions or something, but I think actually this is a very important question because it forces us to come to terms with the huge variegation and really the fragmented reality, first of all, of half a millennium of time that we're talking about. So while for the interests of disciplinary legibility, we might think of a certain period as the Sultanate period. I think, in fact, it brings together such a diverse array of political formations and principalities that it's very hard to give a unilateral, just a monolithic answer for 500 years and also for a wide variety of
Uh,
state formations.
well, Alka, if we confine ourselves only to the Shansabānī monuments, now there is an argument developed by Barry Flood
Mhm.
that sometimes, the older monuments and elements from the older monuments were also used as palimpsests. On the other hand, they were also treated as trophies. I mean, we have examples of that during the early period, there were certain idols and things which were sent to the court of the Khalifa to be buried in front of the gate of his palace. So possibly the question which Mahfouz Priye is asking, what would be your take? Whether the Shansabānī kings, say for example, those who were building Quwwatul Islam for that matter, were they using the temple artifacts in a very secular way that is, they could incorporate the temple, elements within a mosque, and their religion was not hurt, or was it that they wanted to show the supremacy of Islam uh, over the others, and that is why those elements were being reused in their monuments? How
I
would you?
I would say that both of those aims were superbly met, in fact. So that, and we have to remember that we're also dealing with two different registers of historical sources, right? We're dealing with the textual sources to which you made reference about, the narratives regarding the sending of not only idols, but indeed the actual plunder that was captured on these campaigns to different places. And indeed, in the 1190s, evidently there was a lot of plunder from Ajmer that was sent to be sort of showcased in the Pishtaq, or the monumental portal of the mosque at Firozkoh. Now, archaeologically, it is very difficult to find the roots even of that building, never mind the plunder, which disappeared a long time ago. But the actual footprint of the structures that are referred to, and this is something that I discuss at some length in the book. But in the case of the buildings in India, or the North Indian plains, I believe that there definitely must have been some kind of a triumphalist propaganda, because remember, these are brand new kind of, power players who have come into town. This is an immense kind of victory if we think of it just from the point of view of what even their predecessors had not done before. There are no monumental Ghaznavid mosques in the subcontinent. I mean, in northern India. It's the Shansab who did this. So clearly there was an awareness of the consequence of this victory and series of victories thereafter. But I think that there were also much more pragmatic is one thing, but also aesthetic and cultural factors that were in play. Now, if we think about the architectural model that was provided by the Minar at Jam, it definitely does have a dialogue and a relationship with the Qutb. And there is no reason that it should not. I mean, architecturally, there was a certain culture and a language that these folks, the newcomers, were accustomed to inhabiting. And this was what was going to be recreated now in an Indian context. So in order to achieve the elevations and also the larger social and congregational spaces, there were some immediate needs for shifting in the ways of building that the skilled labor was accustomed to. So I think that it served multiple purposes. There was definitely the actual mechanical recreation of these affective spaces in India, where there had not been architectural precedents before. But and the best and most expeditious way to do this was by using already perfectly usable, already existing structural components. But that is not to say that there was not definitely a kind of convenient byproduct of triumphalism that could also be served in this very
Uh, quite correct. I mean, we might come back to this whole debate if we have time later on. And there is another question by Mehfooz
fun.
Priye. Let us first have the second question of Mehfooz Priye.
Yes.
That is that it's a very pertinent question which many people ask. And that is one of the most repeated questions, in fact. Uh, what is the location of whether these monuments were built at the same location from where the debris of the 27 mosques or the temples was extracted? Was it at the same place or what?
Mm. Well, for those of you who have dived deep, boy, that inscription is problematic at best. It is hard to make out, but that's not such a problem because we know that the language of Persian and eventually Arabic was actually in the hands of folks who were instructed to use it. And so it's not the kind of grammatical or other errors that are off-putting. But the point is that it obscures the actual purport or the meaning of what is meant to be said, because we know that the inscription also then sort of equated the 27 temples as a certain number of dillival, right? It was referring to presumably a currency. So I would think that there is more of it is quite possible that indeed somebody kept absolute meticulous records that, oh, these are 27 temples from which we are extracting this material and using. But I think that there is a certain metaphorical component also to the inscription. For one thing, at least some epigraphists have claimed that it was most likely a post facto inscription, so not necessarily written or carved, for that matter, at the very moment when this construction was going on. And there are many such anachronisms throughout the epigraphic records that we have, you know, the retroactive application of titles and so forth, which is abundant in the epigraphic record. And in fact, numismatics are a big part of either adding to the confusion or providing some clarification. So I think that there was more of a thrust of the actual kind of amount of capital, the worth, the currency that was invested in the construction of this complex, not more, but that is an equally important consideration. We shall never know unless we can excavate whether there were actually numerous temples inhabiting this site, and therefore they were on, you know, at the place, actively dismantled and reused. It is absolutely the case that older materials are reused, whether they are all exclusively from temples. I would argue, because there were other types of structures that had actually parallel iconographic markers. At stepwells, were one, and these were, as we know, enormous kind of civic investments. And if, you know, if the actual water source at the bottom of a stepwell was no longer there, if it dried up, if the groundwater table had shifted or reduced, you know, this would be another structure that would be left derelict and perfect for actually quarrying structural materials. And as we know from still existing stepwells, there are commonalities of iconography. So I think that there were multiple sources, not only temples, but multiple sources from which construction materials could have been garnered. This, again, does not reduce the effectiveness in the kind of triumphalist narrative that can be woven from it.
I will just add to what Alka Patel has said, and that is that, Tabaqat-e-Nasri does mention 27 structures, the material of which was used in the construction of the Quwwatul Islam Mosque. But nowhere does the language suggest that it was at the same location, number one. Number two, there is also no suggestion that all those 27 were broken for the purpose of building this new one. So to add to what Dr. Patel said, that even in case the material is coming from the temples, it is not definitive whether the exact location is the same or not. Number two, whether they were on purpose demolished to be replaced by the mosque. One thing which I would like to add, and which I found in the records of the Archaeological Survey of India, and that is that at least in the Qutub Minar, certain of the these sculpted stones, on one side they have these Vaishnava images, but on the reverse side there are certain Jain images also, which I found.
Ah.
So I mean, that has been reported, but it is never dilated upon. But it is there in the ASI reports. So I mean, it is very, very clear that there have been reuses before, and some of these structures were actually Jain or Buddhist structures, which were then converted into Vaishnava, and later on, the material of that was used in the construction of the Quwwatul Islam. There is much more research which can be done into it. Unfortunately, this is a field, as Dr. Alka Patel said, that there are too many confusions, and possibly there might come a time when more researchers, more material would give us a more definitive answer to this. Let us
I,
have the
I
right.
just wanted to say, Professor Rezavi, that there is an inscription actually from the early 14th century, now that I think of it, that actually refers to a broken temple that was used. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, that in fact, this kind of very pragmatic reuse of existing construction materials is something that filters into the epigraphic record here and there as well.
Right. Let us have the question of Jama Sher Rasikh. What categorical, textual, non-Islamic, non-Persian Indic sources in languages such as Sanskrit would or could we have on the Ghorids? Thank you, Alkaji.
What categorical, textual? So thank you for the question, Javan. I would say that the epigraphic records are extremely rich, and these would be the non-Persian Indic sources to which you refer. Of course, there is the whole kind of cycle of bardic tales and so forth, and the book by Cynthia Talbot on Prithviraj, which looks a little bit, well, quite a bit, into the different iterations of this narrative of those early confrontations and conquests, which then actually served as a real kind of identity building narrative, sort of akin, well, I shouldn't so cavalierly draw these outside comparisons, but so there is the whole cycle of narratives surrounding the ruler Prithviraj. But I would say that the Sanskrit and some vernacular language epigraphy, but mainly is Sanskrit, which we see has some kind of vernacular elements. I remember looking through a lot of inscriptions for the Gujarat book and seeing these, and even Dr. Desai characterized, the language used as having some Gujarati-isms in those inscriptions that were specifically from the Gujarat and southern Rajasthan region. So I would say that the Sanskrit epigraphic records are impressively informative. So, for instance, I did make reference also to that inscription, which tends, again, these are references that are couched within Vamshavalis, right? These long panegyric genealogies, basically, but therein we find buried references to again, the great military confrontations that perhaps past rulers might have had. And it's precisely this way that we come upon, for instance, the visitation of Aibak at Kiradu. It's an inscriptional record. So I cannot really overstate, I think, the significance of the Sanskrit epigraphic records in the information that they provide throughout really the second half, one would say, of the 12th century and the very early 13th, if we're looking specifically for Ghurid Shansabānī references.
Right. I mean, we have crossed 1.5 hours. It's 1 hour 40 minutes, and I would really thank Dr. Alka Patel for a very illuminating, you know, talk which she gave today. At least as far as I am concerned, I gained much. There were questions regarding whether, whether the new architecture which was established in the region of Delhi, whether it was a victory architecture, I mean, an architecture which was celebrating the new religion, celebrating the defeat of the other, or was it assimilative in nature? Added to that, I would also put up a question whether in the Shansabānī architecture, do we have any influences apart from the Seljuk influences of the Ghaznavid architecture which the Shansabānīs replaced? We know that when Mahmud invaded the region of Multan, there was a dynasty of the Ismaili kings who was ruling there, and we have sources which inform that there was a Jama Masjid at Multan, from where prayers, azan was being recited, the Shiite azan, and the mosque was demolished by the Ghaznavids. We do have certain archaeological remains of certain mosques in that region, which have been found. Unfortunately, it's only the floors and some of the plinth levels of those mosques which have been found. But can one hazard any guesses that the Shansabānīs might have borrowed from the Ghaznavid architects? We know that the Quwwatul Islam mosque, when it was built on a typical Iranian plan of a mosque, which was perfected during the 8th century. A centrally located courtyard with a western Levan and on the three sides cloisters. The only difference being that in Iran the cloisters are also double-storied or having the same height as the Western Levan. But here, just like in other subsequent mosques of the Indian subcontinent, the three sides Levans, they are the three sides of these galleries, they are only single-storied, lower than the main prayer chamber, so on and so forth. And we know that it was a typical Iranian style of mosque which resulted. Can we hazard a guess that apart from these Persian influences, were there any other influences which went into the making of the Shansabānī architecture? You did show us an example from Afghanistan, that tower, which was a Shansabānī tower, remains of a Shansabānī tower, which very much appears to be one of those which might have inspired the Qutb itself, because as you pointed out that it is one of the earliest. Such Maizana towers, apart from at Quwwatul Islam Mosque, possibly were never built elsewhere by the Shansabānī dynasty in India when they came to India? Or were there any other examples where such towers, apart from the Afghan lands, they were tried to be made in the Indian subcontinent? One other thing which I would like to point out is that uh, there are a large number of inscriptions within the Quwwatul Islam Mosque and the Qutub, Minar itself. Uh, uh, Possibly, I mean, you must have gone through the report of J.A. Page and others who have mentioned the names of masons involved, and there's a book by Pushpa Prasad,
Mhm.
an article in a book where she has also
Very
noted these inscriptions down. What is interesting to note is that all the names of those masons and master craftsmen who are making these monuments, none of them is a Muslim. They're all, the indigenous local
important.
people. Possibly the person who has made the plan is a Central Asian or Shansabānī or whatever you may call it. But the actual people who are executing these monuments, they are the indigenous people. And secondly, I would like to relate this information with one of your articles which you had written. I'm forgetting the name of the article, where you have tried to deal with the message contained in the type of epigraphs which have been used within the mosque complex.
Mm.
I mean, uh, reading those verses from the Quran, whether they are the victory verses or those which point out towards how the non-Muslims, the Zimmis and others would be treated, or how it is a victory of Islam, possibly were never read by those who had been conquered, as you rightly tried to argue. Uh, what type of message was tried to be given through them? Uh, uh,
I think there's
These
a
are the two things which I would like to point out, that because in these type of lectures which we are holding, there may be few people who are listening at the moment, but because it would be put on the YouTube, there would be a large number of people who would be looking at it, not necessarily all with history background, but
mm,
these are some things which should be told to them. So that is why I want your response to these queries of mine.
mhm. So beginning with your last, I think that it's an excellent question to ask what ultimately the effect was. We, as modern 21st century scholars, really look at the content and, demonstrate that we can read and locate the Quranic verses, etc., which to a small segment of the contemporaneous population must have had significance and importance. After all, they were chosen to put on the architectural decorative programs. But I think that even without having access to the actual content, I think there were some very powerful statements to be made that were aesthetic. After all, if we look at the arcaded facade at the Qutb, that came slightly later. Of course, it wasn't part of the very initial construction. And again, this is attested by the epigraphy. Um, the effect that that arcaded facade has with this interlacing of very, very Indic floral iconography with an equally rich aesthetic of the naskh and the thuluth that was used in the actual Quranic inscriptions. I think it in many ways conveys a more powerful, if you will, message precisely because more people can actually feel that, along with the people who read the inscriptions, all the way around the facade and can make out the contents. But they also, along with all the non-readers, would feel the brand new kind of space that is being created with structures like this. And already by the 12th century, the actual scripted language was a major aesthetic component of what we think of broadly as Islamic art and architecture. And again, trying to leave behind presentist attitudes that in many ways belittle or think of aesthetics as frivolous. Indeed, the overall effect, aesthetic and otherwise, that was created by these structures, as we established, being brand new types of buildings. These types of buildings just hadn't been made, certainly in this region previously. So I think that would have had a tremendous effect, which I'm sure the patrons were most likely aware of, by the sheer contrast, both in monumentality as well as the layout of the building, as well as the use of a totally different decorative iconography that included script, which wasn't a part of the kind of Indic aesthetic fabric prior to that. Or it had been only on a very, very small scale. The examples that I showed from Bhadreshwar, for instance, of those mercantile communities, at least the structure that's in better shape, hopefully still, the little tomb structure, it does have a Kufic script, and there are fragments also in the much more deteriorated mosque structures. So indeed, there had been a kind of transplantation of those types of aesthetic practices into northern India, but the sheer scale of the Qutb was unprecidented. It must have been magnificent.
Right.
Or awe-inspiring, many things.
Thank you for pointing out that from this early period, generally, as far as the non-historians or those who have studied history in school are concerned, they think that the exchange of Hindu-Muslim ideas as reflected in architecture is something which started only during the period of Akbar. It was only he that where features derived from Hindu architecture.
Oh, he was late to the game. This started much earlier.
But the work of Alka Patel and others who have worked on the Shansabānī monuments show that as early as the 12th century or 13th century, there was an exchange of ideas. In monuments which are not mosques, monuments which are made in Bhadreshwar and other places, we have those, Kufic verses which are being utilized. Those architectural elements which one identifies with temple architecture are being taken out from there and being used in buildings which are being sponsored by the kings who are the new conquerors in this land. They are incorporating those traditions within their fort. Unfortunately, it is from our colonial period that this dichotomy, this particular understanding of dividing even the architecture on the basis of Hindu and Muslim have started, so much so that today we call certain elements as Hindu, call certain elements as Muslim. In fact, the founder of my institution, the great Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, is also responsible for this type of an understanding. When he was writing his Asarus Sanadid, and when he was surveying the mosque constructed by Qutbuddin Aibak, Iltutmish, and the other sultans, he started calling it as Quwwatul Islam, the might of Islam. If you go to the Sultanate period sources, none of them uses the term Quwwatul Islam. There is no might of Islam. There is no sense of we dominating over the other, which is ever. It is either called as Masjid-e-Jame simply,
Mm.
or it is known as the mosque. And at one or two places, the term which has been used as an adjective for this mosque is Qubbatul Islam, the
Don't.
dome of Islam, which, the center of, here, the term Islam should not be taken uh, uh, in some other sense. I mean, this is not the time to go into all the details. But remember, Qubbatul Islam just means the canopy of protection. Islam stands for peace, a land which has now been brought under peace, a land where all type of saints and priests and Sufis who are being hounded by the Mongols in Central Asia, they are coming and taking shelter. And it is here in these realms that a capital has been established. Let us also not forget that this particular monument was created in the heart of a city which had been founded by the by Anangpal, which was later on built by Prithviraj Chauhan. We have the Prithviraj Raso, which, although a bardic text, but gives us the detail of when and how the city was founded. There are a number of epigraphs found in Rajasthan, possibly Bikaner, if I'm not wrong, where we find the term that these Chahamanas and Chauhans were holding a territory which was known as Dhillika
Mm.
or
Yeah.
Delhi. We have an inscription on the iron pillar of Chandragupta, not the Chandragupta Maurya, but a Chandragupta who was a local ruler. And certain historians and archaeologists, for example, Cunningham, tried to read one of the inscriptions epigraphs on that as having the term Dhillika or Dhilli. There are certain people who contest that idea and they say that it is not so. But the term Dhillika for this capital city, where the Qubbatul Islam and other monuments by the Shansabānī dynasty were built, this place, even if we do not believe that this iron pillar has this term Dhillika on it, even if we take the other accounts, and there are two manuscripts where this term Dhillika occur. So there are certain epigraphs away from Delhi, and there are at least two manuscripts which predate and which are basically from the Chahamana period, which mention the existence of a city uh, of the Parmars and Chauhans, which was known as the Dillika, which was conquered by the newly conquering Shansabānī sultans. This particular place during the early Sultanate sources is referred to as Dehliye Kohna, the same term which was found in certain other manuscripts and epigraphs, Dhilika or Dehli, which is also allegedly found on the iron pillar, which is now fixed within the Qubbatul Islam, that Dhillika, that is the term which gives us the modern name of Delhi, which was there. Possibly, uh, I would like to, argue, I mean, I might be totally wrong, that these Shansabānī rulers, when they were creating these monuments of theirs with architectural elements which today we call as Hindu architecture, were actually representing the architecture of a newly conquered territory.
Mhm.
Just like in the architecture of Akbar, we have examples of architecture of Rajputana, Gujarat, Bengal, various regions over which he was ruling. They were represented in, say, for example, at Fatehpur Sikri. My interpretation is that those Shansabānī monuments, which were created during the 12th century or in that period, they were not, looking down at one piece of architecture or the other. They were actually incorporating different traditions in the new territory, which had now been conquered and was now being ruled by this dynasty. Alka, this is a debate which would keep on going. These are all, hazardous guesses. We may keep on guessing, uh, but thank you very much for reminding us of these issues. And I really uh, hope that we will get your new book soon to read. I would take this opportunity to thank you once more. You took out time, and for 2 solid hours, you were there in our program, answering questions, half the time speaking, the other time, 1 hour at least, in answering the queries which have been put by the audiences.
I
As
very
far as
much appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
thank you. As far as the audiences are concerned, let me once again say the times for holding such lectures, it is not a very conducive time. I know each and every one of us are surrounded by tragedies which are taking place all around us, at least in certain very major states of North India. Today itself, just before the start of the lecture, uh, I received the news of the death of one of my colleagues who had also been one of my students, who passed away uh, just half an hour before the start of the lecture.
Oh,
Uh, we are actually passing through a very bad phase. Let me also point out that it is not the pandemic which is taking our lives, it is the pathetic mismanagement. Most of the deaths which are occurring are because of non availability of beds and non availability of oxygen for those patients who are getting admitted, those who need oxygen. So these are pathetic times. Certain people did ask me कि इस पीरियड में क्यों लेक्चर्स कर रहे हो, किसके पास टाइम है सुनने का. बट आई वुड अर्ज ऑल ऑफ अस, लेट अस रिमेन पॉजिटिव. जो हो रहा है वो तो होता रहेगा, लेकिन लेट अस कीप ऑन डूइंग आवर वर्क. एक ये दिस होल प्रोसेस जो आज ये एक वबा बन के हमारे सामने फैला हुआ है, उसकी शुरुआत हुई थी with the circulation of myths as far as our history was concerned. And as students of history, our basic duty is to grapple with these myths and present before you the facts which we think are facts, which are actually informations derived from the primary information. Today, Alka Patel talked on the basis of her own surveys and on the basis of her own researches to show what type of structures and buildings were created during the period of the Shansabānī dynasty. We are not denying that there were no clashes. There were clashes, there were differences, but then there were also give and takes even at that early period, at that particular moment of time when a so-called new belligerent, uh, you know, group was coming and trying to establish its rule in India. Thank you, Alka, once again. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Good night. Goodbye. Uh, बहुत बहुत आप सबका शुक्रिया.
Thank you. Namaskar. Bye.